20% of the population and a much higher proportion of young people, and especially young male-identified people, were watching wrestling. And what I can tell you is I have spoken with Republican staffers who were like, the big athletic event in the Beltway was baseball and basketball. And then once Trump rolled into office and this huge wave of millennial staffers from the Republican Party showed up, they all talked about wrestling. Wrestling was the thing that these people had grown up on and had sort of learned how to manipulate people through, at least in part.
When movements organize themselves around lies, it's easy to denounce them. But if we want to understand them as well, I think we've found a good place to begin. Abraham Josephine Riesman's New York Times bestseller, Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America, points out that professional wrestling, television shows, social media spheres, and politics have essentially melded into one big show. He argues that fans of wrestling, like followers of Donald Trump, recognize that their heroes are performers who have perfected the art of mass manipulation. But instead of rejecting wrestling as fake or replacing Trump with a political leader who lies to them less often, millions of Americans have learned to play their own roles in an endless call and response, where truth is whatever their leader wishes to make it, and pretending to believe something can be more powerful than holding beliefs of any kind. This is Eric Byler. Both Josie and I were fans of professional wrestling as children. We know what it's like to be immersed in a world where you always know who to hate. And if someone you hate ever wins, be it a wrestling match or an election, it must be because of cheating, which makes you hate them even more. We're not suggesting that you should like wrestling or even watch it. You will hear Josie say that wrestling has messed with the chemistry of her brain. But in the same way that we study religion to better understand our fellow human beings, we feel that this particular evolution in mass media fandom should be a subject of study as well. Well, I think for the person who has no idea that Trump was even in Wrestlemania or any of that, as soon as you mention professional wrestling, they just roll their eyes and go, well, how could that possibly be relevant to anything? Of course, we could make the leap directly to Trump, but I wonder if you could connect to culture first.
Sure. I mean, you have a world that either by influence or convergent evolution has ended up with a lot of industries and sectors looking like pro wrestling. You have cable news where you have these pundits who are set at each other to fight and yap, but they have the same employer. They're generating conflict within the umbrella of authoritarian harmony. Now, this is classic pro wrestling, but also I think about this a lot with business and guys like Elon Musk. This wrestling principle of you commit totally to a fiction, or more modernly, like you take mixed fact and fiction, but you have to commit totally to it to the point where even you forget that you're lying at all. Or you stop caring that you're lying and no longer sound like you're lying because you just seem so committed to the thrill. And I think about this a lot with Elon Musk and other captains of industry. They are surrounded by people who are constantly lying to them as yes men, and they have no real conception of reality or truth or fiction anymore. It's just, what can I do to get what I want? Which is, again, wrestling incarnate. You have the illusion of morality, but really it's just about poking people's lizard brains and getting them to have visceral reactions, which is now what politics has become, especially on the right wing. We're stuck in this world that is a hall of mirrors filled with smoke, where you don't even know what the lies are. You don't know where any lie or truth begins and ends, and that's just a dangerous place to be in. It's like this is the cognitive empire that we're in right now. Mm-hmm. Just not knowing what is real and what isn't, which is the place that pro wrestling figured out could be very profitable for it, 25 years ago.
Let's try to put it on a cultural timeline. First of all, there's the reality television and the cable news shift, right?
Yeah, reality TV post-dates wrestling, but has a tremendous amount in common with wrestling. You put people into a situation where they act like themselves, but heightened and altered, And then the audience is spending all their time going, I can't tell whether that was legit or not, but it's fascinating that it happened. Or I want to try and figure out whether it was real or not and figure out which parts of this are real. Or you just let it wash over you. I coined a term for this modern state of total chaos between fact, fiction, half-truths, and all three being presented with total sincerity by powerful people or people who are instruments of power. And I use the term neo-kayfabe. Now, that comes from the wrestling term kayfabe, which is a term referring to especially the old way of doing things, which was you knew what the truth was, but you presented a lie, and you committed to it very deeply if you were a wrestler. You said, like, oh, I am my character, and I really do hate these guys, and these wrestling matches are not predetermined. You would know the truth, but you present a lie with total commitment. Now we have this situation where it's much more complicated, and I call it neo-kayfabe, where you have not just wrestlers going out there and saying, well, I know who I am, but I'm presenting a character. They're presenting a character in the ring, and then there's the character of their backstage persona. And then there's the character of who they interact with everybody. And all of it is built with pieces of truth now. Like, you have to have some aspect of your life that is accurately being represented. And it's all to manipulate you. It's all to make you think you're seeing some version of the truth, but to keep you off your balance so you don't know what is and is not truth. And this is why neo-kayfabe is so effective as a tactic, not just in wrestling. It's that once the human mind is swimming in these choppy waters between fact and fiction and trying to figure out which direction to go in, you're on high alert and you're paying close attention. And in the attention economy, that's what matters. If Trump can get up there, or any politician or media figure or business titan, and say something or do something completely bizarre, then you're paying attention. And not just because it's bizarre or unusual, but because you're trying to figure out whether they meant it or whether it even really happened. And the human mind doesn't like ambiguity, so it will work really hard at focusing on this thing that you can't quite parse. And that's dangerous. But if you're talking about the broader cultural timeline of how wrestling ended up influencing things, two generations really, Gen X and then the millennials, who had these two intervals separated by like 15 years or so, where Vince McMahon's product becomes enormously popular. There's the mid-'80s, the so-called rock and wrestling era, when you have, the real icon is Hulk Hogan, and everything's going national and becoming glitzy and Reaganite and all of that. Mm-hmm. Then 15 years later-ish, you end up with the Attitude Era in the late 90s. And while Gen X kids were watching the rock and wrestling era and getting hyped up about it, that had dissipated. But then in the late 90s, you get this entirely new generation of children and teens watching a very different wrestling product. It was like 20% of the population, and a much higher proportion of young people, and especially young male-identified people, were watching wrestling. Wrestling was so popular at those two periods that you really underestimate at your own risk the degree to which the obsessive kids of yesteryear are now the important decision makers, or at least gullible audience members of contemporary American politics.
Yeah, it gives you sort of like a line into the brain if you want to manipulate people for whatever purpose.
Yep.
Advertising, politics.
Sure.
I try to understand people that I speak to, even if it's an interview or not an interview. I try to understand them. And going back to my professional wrestling watching childhood is one of the ways that I've been able to speak to the Trump supporter and understand where they're coming from. So I want to speak to a specific time before they admitted professional wrestling was fake. And there were really only two people in my class, me and Scott Dillard, 5th grade, who liked professional wrestling. I would spend my recesses, for a period of time anyway, fake professional wrestling with Scott Dillard.
Nice.
And then these girls would come up to us and say, "What are you doing? That is so stupid. Don't you know professional wrestling is fake?" And we would go, "No, it isn't fake." I know it's fake, but in my mind, I'm thinking, I can't admit that I know it's fake, because then those girls who think I'm stupid and my friend Scott Dillard is stupid, they'll win. So I'm going to insist that it's real.
You've been wrestling professionally how long?
7 years.
About 7 years. Always under the name Hulk Hogan?
Do I have to tell the truth?
No, not necessarily. You can lie. We lie a lot on the show.
Yes.
Make up anything. Are most of the bouts fixed, or is that a bad question?
Very bad question.
Bad question.
But the
Put that down as a bad question.
The thing is, I wish they were fixed, because then it would be a lot easier. But professional wrestling is the cream of the crop. It's mostly the wrestlers that come from the Olympics and very good amateur wrestlers that make the grade and they get into professional wrestling. And if it was fixed, it'd be very easier for me. But right now, it's like a fight for your life every time you step in there.
It really is that dangerous.
Definitely.
Hogan said, oh, no, it's totally real. It's totally real. And he didn't give an inch. And so there I am, 9 years old or whatever I was, thinking, yes, Hulk Hogan, he's representing me, right? Now, a part of me knew he was lying, but he was lying for me.
Yes! Yes! You nailed it! You nailed it. I might steal that framing, he's lying for me. I will cite you, but that's exactly right. People go, yes, it's a lie, but it's my lie. And I'm going to believe in that lie so much that I'll forget it's a lie. And even if part of me remembers it's a lie, I'll shut that part up because that part's allied with you. And I hate you. Not you personally, but you know what I mean? Like this idea of they're trying to get me to not pay attention to this lie and to say it's a lie. But I hate them so much that I'll just commit to this lie to the point where I forget that it's a lie. And the lie initially is accepted because it's believed that this person who's lying is lying for you.
Yes. I didn't realize about the other things that happened where they actually brutalized reporters for asking them this. I didn't see that. But when he just bold-faced lied, he was lying for me.
Yes. Yes. I don't even have anything to add to that. That's exactly right. You've completely cracked the code. It's a kind of, we have this concept of negative partisanship, that people join or parties or vote for parties just because they hate the other parties so much. And that works in interpersonal relationships too. I think about like dumb little spats that me and my spouse occasionally have, where what you have to overcome is the human instinct to dig in your heels. It's so hard to overcome that instinct. Like, it's very powerful when someone's attacking you, even if you know you're in the wrong, your fight or flight instinct kicks in and you just start doubling down on something that's not true necessarily. And it's really hard to fight that. Like, I spend a lot of time consciously thinking about this stuff, and I still find myself like getting into an argument, not just with my spouse, but with anybody, and like feeling at least the temptation to go, I'm right, even if I know I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's one thing to know they're right. It's another thing to admit that you know they're right. To connect it to Trumpism, what he does is he says things that are easily disprovable, and then all the serious journalists disprove it, and then he says, but I'm still right. And I think that there are a lot of people who see him as a hero for this, because underneath the lie is the truth that they want to tell.
I think you're completely right. It's about encoding a deeper truth, which is not necessarily an objective truth, but an emotional truth. And that emotional truth of, I have a desire to be on top or to be safe, which is often the same thing in people's minds, then that emotional truth overrides objective truth. It's just not as important to people, especially in a time like now where people feel really much like they are in crisis and danger. Whether it's terrorists or trans people, there's just a constant perception of a threat that's coming to you and that will be there imminently. Or Black Lives Matter protests, for that matter. Just all of these things that are not actually a threat to your safety, but are a threat to your status, which you perceive as your safety. Your status is what protects you in your mind. So if someone is threatening your status just by existing or existing in politics, people's fight or flight response kicks in. It's stupid, but that's what happens.
Well, if you're not naturally afraid of people of color just when you see them in the street, your television can certainly make you that way.
Absolutely. You see it every time there's any kind of movement for black justice in this country. You have Fox News and now the even more wretched channels like Newsmax or Patriot Line, whatever, I don't know. They will just tell you like, hey, you heard about those protests that are happening? Well, they're coming to your suburb. They'll be there tomorrow. They want you. They're going to get you. And it's very much rooted in the same kind of principles pro wrestling. It's really easy to manipulate people that way.
Well, what you said earlier, I think really crystallizes it. Whether it's professional wrestling or cable news or reality television or politics in general, there's a manipulation of the employees to act out a story where it's very clear who you're supposed to hate. When Trump was rising as a political star, I point to birtherism as the first time he introduced himself as a political figure. And if you remember, Mitt Romney had to kiss his ring before the 2012 election, even though Romney, of course, later, came out as not really...
Over and over again. I mean, it was just Romney kept kissing the ring and then saying he didn't like it. I mean, that's been the story of Mitt Romney since 2011 or 2012.
Right. But okay, when I saw professional wrestling cadence and gimmicks in Trump, it surprised me, but not so much, because I had seen professional wrestling leak into Fox News and then into journalism in general. But what really struck me was, as a journalist also, it was my job to go to Trump rallies. And I started to recognize my childhood self in Trump supporters. They come to this carnival where everybody's been watching the same show, and they get to all be Trump supporters together. And it gives them a sense of community. And the only price they have to pay is they have to believe, or at least say they believe, some of these lies.
You're totally right. Yeah, I mean, fandom is powerful and it's terrifying. Fandom is now what we seek as community among a lot of us, because we don't have other communities available to us, and fandom is so easy to get into a community about online. That's where our communities largely exist now, is in these online spaces. I mean, I'm not the first person to say this about fascism, but fascism's ultimate appeal is it allows you to return to childhood in your fantasies. You get to have tantrums, you get to get everything you want, you get to crush your enemies, and most importantly, you get to feel safe. You get to feel like you have a community that loves you and will protect you, and your strength will be your salvation. It doesn't work like that, but that promise that you can go back, that you can turn the clock back and be a child again, is a huge part of the appeal of any kind of fascist movement, but especially Trumpism, which is so wrapped up in this weird nostalgia, not just for political realities, but for weird cultural objects. I mean, think about the 40-minute dance show he did a few weeks ago, where he just played songs he liked. We have these very atomized existences where you're rarely in a group of like-minded people physically. And that was what was so exciting to the January 6th rioters. I was just reading reports about the comedian and actor Jay Johnston, who participated in the January 6th riot, and who I used to be a huge fan of. It's so fascinating, like the way that he was texting his friends about going to January 6th. He described it as the grand affair. The idea was there was going to be this big party, and it was going to be a bunch of people who liked each other, and they were hanging out. It was like Comic-Con. Mm-hmm. You have these reports of Jay Johnston during the riot in the fighting in the Capitol, making wacky jokes. I mean, it was like he was trying to liven up the crowd and keep people going. And they loved it, I'm sure. So that's what we're dealing with, is this fandom world of we all have this totemic thing that we're all watching. That is what brings us together, is our favorite character or our favorite show. And for a lot of Trump voters, their favorite character is Donald Trump. They want to go celebrate their favorite character.
Yeah. And it's not that different, really. I mean, I know a little bit more about Star Trek than comic books.
Sure. But that's a great comparison, too. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't actually on purpose gone to a Star Trek convention, but in the course of promoting films that I made, we kind of crossed paths. And I noticed some people speaking in Klingon to each other. And I thought to myself, my God, you love this show so much that you learned a language that has no other use
than meeting other fans and having a shibboleth. Yeah, exactly. That means a lot to people.
Yeah. What did you think of the Vince McMahon docuseries on Netflix?
It wasn't my cup of tea. I mean, it's although I think it was useful insofar as it introduced a lot of people to some of the basic transgressions that Vince committed or allegedly committed at WWF. This is a very serious story that I believe is very important. And I did not think that the docuseries did an excellent job of presenting it. It was very mealy-mouthed in its criticism of Vince McMahon. There was this tendency to say, yes, he did some bad things, but look what he did for the business, which is entirely expected because this is a documentary that was made by Netflix, who has a $5 billion deal with WWE, as the company is now known. And they weren't going to say anything that indicted the entire company or the entire industry / art form, which is where you really need to start. These were not isolated incidents that have no precedent elsewhere in wrestling outside of Vince McMahon. Everything Vince McMahon did or is accused of doing is in keeping with the culture of wrestling. That's the scary part that the series was unable to acknowledge.
I'm going to undo my pants. I'm going to unzip my pants.
Oh, no. Look at the look on Trish's face. Here it comes.
Sue, do you take dictation?
Yes, of course I do.
I just love an attractive personal assistant who takes great dictation.
It's this very clever trick where you say, we are going to acknowledge that evil exists and that we know what evil acts are. And then we're going to have people do those evil acts and have other people denounce them. And that will give you, the audience, the illusion that since we know what morality is, we must be living morally. And that there must be a moral center to this. Because no one would want to just do evil if they knew what the evil acts were, right? Like, that's the thing, the trick they pull off, is Mr. McMahon, the character, does these horrible things that Vince McMahon actually does. But because they're presenting them in the program as evil acts, you have this subconscious assumption that Vince is like, okay, well, I go out there and play an evil guy, but since I know what evil is, I would never do it. But that's not true. I don't think, if Vince knows what evil is, he likes doing it. And it's very possible that he convinced himself that evil does not exist. That they can call people evil, but that there isn't really an evil. There's just what you do to get power and to get by. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no love, there's no hate. There's just what can I get for myself and how far can I get? How much can I accumulate? Mm-hmm. And that's dangerous because evil does exist. I'm not saying that in a religious sense necessarily, but we have standards of morality for a reason. They are there for social stability. And when you have this entire couple of generations who think they can just get out there and say, reality is what I make it and morality doesn't exist, then you're really on a careening path to hell.
I think there's an interesting thing in this conversation that you're a member of the LGBT community. I'm a person of color. And yet we were fans.
Yeah, sure.
Grew up to look back. And I'm sure you noticed that anytime they portrayed a person who was effeminate in any way, it was to make this enormous arena of people hate them, right? In order to manipulate the enormous arena of people. And I, of course, noticed that that was true of all the people of color.
And in both cases, there were exceptions, of course. But for the most part, you're completely right. I mean, there was this concept of, if you'll forgive the term, the fag heel, which goes all the way back to Gorgeous George in the 50s, if not before. Somebody who is a man who is bad, and the way you telegraph that they're bad is having them like perfume or wear frilly robes. And the idea is like, this isn't a real man. And it's especially humiliating when that not real man beats a quote-unquote real man in the ring, usually by cheating, and that infuriates the audience. It's very much, or at least it used to be, the 2 minutes hate from 1984, except towards queer people or minorities. Or I remember seeing lots of LGBTQ stereotypes on wrestling when I was growing up in the late 90s.
And yet, you watched it.
Here I am. I know. It's a very powerful science or art. You know, I mean, it's something that really messes with your brain chemistry, and I think that's powerful.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because I was very effeminate as a teenager, and was constantly made fun of for it. That was really the source of the bullying.
Yeah.
So when I started watching wrestling, it was this interesting little induction into what society wanted from men or from boys. And I wrote this essay that came out when the book came out called Wrestling Turned Me Cis and Then It Turned Me Trans. And that's basically how I feel. Like, wrestling was my blueprint for how to be what society wanted a dude to be. And then when I dropped it and 20 years went by, and then when I revisited it for my book, over the course of the research, I came to see I say queer subtext, and people think I just mean because it's naked, oily men wrestling each other. No, what I'm saying is the queer subtext is, although that is part of it, the queer subtext is the essential irreducible element of a wrestling match is you have to show vulnerability. Because even if you're not actually strong or your opponent is not actually strong, if they can grab your finger and pretend to be pulling it back, the match exists because the person whose finger is being pulled goes, it hurts so much. That's what makes the match work, not strength. It's vulnerability. And once I realized that, that was sort of part of this larger gender journey I was on. And I came out as trans the week I finished the first draft of the book. And those two things were not unrelated. I felt like I had gone through this Heart of Darkness journey through machismo in Vince's career and life. And when I finished it, I was like, this may be okay for other people, but I want no part of it anymore. So wrestling has a lot of elements there. I mean, these days, I think neo-kayfabe has infected everything. Now, do I think it's, I don't think it's reversible, but I think we can go through. I have a lot of journalist friends who are still on Elon Musk's X, formerly Twitter. I've given up trying to get them to get off. I hope they will. But the reason to be off of that site is even if you think you're too smart for the fascists, you're constantly being barraged with fascist imagery and messaging. And after a while, that has an effect. Maybe I'll leave you with a Jewish quotation, which I think about a lot in these realms, which is, there's a line from the Sayings of Our Fathers, the Pirkei Avot, very ancient text. It says, Midvar shaker tirchak, which means stay away from a lie. Not just don't lie, but if you know there are lies, don't go near them. Don't listen to them. Once you have confirmed that they are lies, avoid them because they infect you. After a while, your empathy kicks in and you start going, well, maybe they have a point. And I'm not, it's dangerous because you can end up in a total silo, but part of the challenge of media literacy is going, I'm not going to expose myself to propaganda over and over and over again, because even if I think I'm too smart for it, it has an effect.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me.
This was great. What a great conversation. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Wrestling Darkness is written, recorded, and edited by yours truly, Eric Byler. The music is composed by Michael Brook, who scored all of my feature-length films, while this jazzy improv rendition you are hearing now was performed by David Benene and Stephen Munoz, who performed at my wedding. Wrestling Darkness and other content you will find on the Eric Byler Substack feed are supported by a 501c3 nonprofit called ID Alliance. You can support us by subscribing or by making a tax-deductible donation. Thanks for listening.